Welcome to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast where we explore all things theology and therapy. I'm your host, Grace Brown, registered psychotherapist with Journey with Grace Counseling Services, also certified Canadian counselor.
And I'm Brad Watson, author and pastor of Nexus Church. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Good morning, Grace, and welcome to our listeners to another episode of The Sacred Sofa. How are you today, Grace?
Doing great, Brad. Excited about more talk on marriage on a ladder.
Marriage on a ladder, yes. So let's get to it. We alluded to this in a previous episode, sort of the 7 rungs on the ladder of marriage. And I'm sure people have their own thoughts on what those are. But we talked about, from a theological perspective, marriage is a permanent, exclusive, sexual relationship of total allegiance, shared identity, self-sacrificial love, mutual self-giving. That's a mouthful there. But those are the 7 ingredients. And if you're doing all of those, if you're achieving all 7 of those, you're at the top of the ladder, you're probably doing well. But here's the thing, no relationship is static, right? We slip, we climb down, we lose some of these day by day, season by season. So what I thought we might do today, Grace, is simply talk about these 7 elements and the factors that can threaten them in a relationship. So again, just to get the 7 through people's heads: permanent, exclusive, sexual, loyal, shared identity, sacrificial, and mutual self-giving or intimacy. So that's sort of the overlay that we're going to look at today, and we'll jump into all 7 of them. But Grace, anything you want to add there?
I thought I would do a little bit of information here in terms of some research that I've been doing. There's interesting research that continues to come out about legally binding marriages in Canada. For as long as I can remember, there's always been this stat floating around by most everyone you ask, whether they're a scholar or not. They often mention that 50% of marriages end in divorce. You've heard that before?
I have, and I know it's not quite what it seems.
It's not quite what it seems. In case you and our listeners ever wondered, as I have, it's actually a myth. And it's a myth that's been circulating around since the 70s. And even though it's been debunked by experts time and time again, there's still that social response when folks start talking about marriage. Goldenberg Jones, who happens to be a divorce attorney in the US, he says the reality of the 50% divorce rate was never a reality. This number is based on projections from the 1970s that eventually would get that high, but it never did. Projections held that if 2% of married couples continued to divorce each year, over the ensuing decades, the number would reach 50% or even higher. But we never got there. And so it's a myth. It's one of those things that keeps circling, kind of like things on the internet that keep popping up that actually isn't true. And when we talk about 50% of marriages end in divorce, it can make people be very discouraged to even consider committing to a long-term relationship and or marriage. And despite the fact that the decline of legal marriages registered in Canada in 2020, that Canada acknowledges that marriages have declined. 2020 hit an all-time low, and they do actually relate that to some of the effects of the pandemic. But according to Dr. Renee Dennison of Psychology Today, she said the average couple has a 75% chance of staying married. So statistically, 1 in 4 couples may divorce, but 75% of a chance gets to stay married. That's huge. That's a very huge far cry from that myth of a statistic folks are floating around with. So 2020 was the lowest numbers current, and even in 2020, 98,355 marriages were registered. That means, doing the math, Brad, 196,170 couples took time, money, and survived the stress of pursuing a legally binding marriage.
You know what, Grace? I am so glad you brought that up. That is something that I hear people throw about, and I always say to them, you know what? I don't think that's true, but I never know where to look, and I never have the right stats in front of me. I've known it was a myth, but I've never had the numbers. So thank you for that, because if it is 1 and 2, it is really discouraging to think that maybe what's the point if I've got
Mm-hmm.
if it's a coin toss whether this is going to work or not, what's the point, So thank you for bringing that. I think that's fantastic.
I thought it was a great segue as we talk about the top rung being permanent in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go there.
Okay, and I mean, this probably sounds pretty obvious to listeners, right? Marriage is permanent. Yes, of course. When we get married, we all vow till death do us part, right? We get this, but what we often don't get, I think, or notice are the things that threaten the permanency of marriage. So I want to
Mhm.
concentrate on those things for this rung of the ladder. Now, Dr. John Gottman, I think everyone's probably heard of him at some point. He's a renowned psychologist, relationship expert who, in his research, apparently, this is wild, can predict divorce to a 93% accurate rate.
Mhm.
93% of the time, he can tell if a couple's heading that way. That's astounding to me. So he's seen it all. He knows what behaviors are predictors of a marriage that is on a trajectory to end. And he calls them the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which I think is funny. And
Good
according to
metaphor.
Gottman, yeah, exactly. If a combination of these four horsemen is present continuously in your marriage, you may be headed to separation or divorce. So, Grace, what I was hoping to do is just identify these four horsemen. And then I was hoping that maybe you could expand on them a bit, maybe give us some ways to avoid or correct them. So,
Mhm.
here are the four horsemen of the apocalypse relationship traits. Number 1, criticism. Number 2, contempt. Number 3, defensiveness. And number 4, stonewalling. Now,
Mhm.
some of those I've heard about, others not. Maybe you could explain each of those, maybe help us think about ways to avoid them.
Mhm. Mhm. I am a really avid fan of the Gottmans' work. They're a
Mm,
married couple, long-term married couple who've been doing very practical, evidence-based research as well
mm,
as therapeutic support for couples all around the world, all
mm,
around the world. And I'm very familiar with the concept of the four horsemen. It's something that I will do in my work with relationship counseling as well. You know, the key word there is continuously showing up in the relationship. It makes me think of the lyrics from that Odell song. You grace me with your cold shoulder. You showered me with words made of knives. It's just like, ah, this is
yes.
deep, intense stuff. So I use their research in my practice. It's a mixture of evidence-based research, compassion, and practical strategies for relationships.
Mm,
Really love their stuff. I read somewhere years ago that threatening to leave or divorce in a relationship actually creates incredible uncertainty in a relationship. And
mm,
that's where the cracks begin.
mm,
Added to that with the four horsemen, it's intense. But there is hope. So let's talk a little bit about the four horsemen. So the first one is criticism. This is
mm,
where you're verbally attacking your partner's personality or their character. Contempt, this is attacking a sense of self with the intent to insult or even over time abuse. Defensiveness, this is making yourself like a victim in order to ward off a perceived attack
mm,
or reverse the blame. And then stonewalling is this concept of withdrawing, shutting yourself off to either avoid conflict or even convey disapproval, distance, and separation. That's that
mm,
cold, icy shoulder sort of concept.
mm. Okay.
The beautiful thing with Gottman is he doesn't just leave you with the negative piece. He invites practical strategies or the antidotes to the four horsemen. So instead of criticism, he talks about a gentle startup. This is where you
Hmm.
talk about your feelings using I messages. So whenever we say you, that puts a person on defensive.
Right.
The person can feel attacked. I statements and express a positive need. So less, you never listen to me. More, I don't feel heard in this moment. I really
Mm.
like it when you take time to focus on what I'm saying. See how that would be
Good
received
stuff. Yeah,
differently?
very differently. Yep.
Contempt. Over time, when you feel like your needs aren't being met or you're talking over and over again, repeating yourself, you can very easily start to slide in contempt for your partner, who they are, and then a lot of criticism moves into contemptuous
Mm.
language and posturing. So instead of that, you're building a culture of appreciation, Gottman says, reminding yourself of your partner's positive qualities and finding gratitude for positive actions. So the mind game is fierce, Brad. What you're
Mm,
saying to yourself about your partner can also lend to contempt. So less, thinking in your head, this person never listens to me. They don't actually care about me. They don't care about where we're going as a family. It's like, okay, reminding myself, okay, my partner loves me. Something might be going on that's interrupting their ability to be present in the relationship right now. Let me remind myself of how many times they were actually engaged or giving or supportive. And then making sure I focus on those things rather than things that aren't happening.
yeah.
Even
Wow.
the small things, taking out the trash, doing the laundry, picking up the kids, like where we focus is where the relationship's going to go. The third one is defensiveness. This is where making yourself a victim rather than the opposite, the antidote would be to take responsibility.
Mm,
Trying with curiosity to accept your partner's perspective and offer an apology for any wrongdoing.
mm,
Less, I was stressed out at work. This is why I dot 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 versus, you know what? You're right, honey. I didn't come home with a proper attitude. I came in hot, stressed at work. I did raise my voice. I'm gonna do better. I'm gonna do
mm,
better to just take care of myself before I come home and make sure I'm not bringing in the stress of work home with me.
mm.
Okay? Less defensiveness, more taking responsibility,
Right.
being curious and listening to your partner's perspective. And finally, stonewalling. This is where you're withdrawing, shutting yourself off from to avoid conflict, or even we talk about silent treatment. This is
Right.
where that comes from. So instead of that, you're self soothing physiologically and psychologically. If you're stressed out, take a break. Spend time doing something that's soothing and distracting and relaxing so that you can be prepared to receive perspective from your partner rather than shutting them out.
Oh, that's great stuff there, Grace. That is really helpful, I think. And I love those antidotes. That's a great way to be thinking about all of that. That's great.
Mhm.
Anything else to add, or should we move on to rung
The key
two?
is there's hope,
Hope.
recognizing that the four horsemen are coming or
Yeah.
lingering, and then with practical strategies, putting the antidote in place. It doesn't have to be the end of the relationship if you're taking the opportunity to get support.
Yeah, and it really speaks to how the ladder works, right? Because it's easy for any of those four things to sneak in,
Hmm.
depending, on your emotional space that you're in
Hmm.
any given day, right? So it's easy to
Hmm.
see how they come in, but those are great practical strategies for dealing with them. Let's move to the second rung, Grace, which is exclusive. Okay, and again, that also sounds maybe a little obvious, but I want to talk and ask some questions around something that is a bit vague to me.
Hmm.
Most of us, Grace, understand exclusivity, sorry, to
Hmm.
mean I will not have a sexual relationship with anyone else. Fair enough. And most of us know that if our partner did, well, that would threaten the permanency of the marriage. But I
Hmm.
want to talk about something more vague, the emotional affair.
Hmm.
And what I find interesting and alarming, Grace, is two things. In the research I've done, many relational experts and couples agree that an emotional affair is just as damaging to a relationship as a physical one. Now,
Hmm.
on its own, that is fine. But the alarming part to me is this: nobody has a really good definition to me or a standard of what actually constitutes an emotional affair. The
Hmm.
boundaries seem very vague. Like, when does it cross the line from being a friendship into something else? So I
Hmm.
thought, Grace, maybe you could help our listeners. What exactly, how would you define an emotional affair, and how does it differ from, say, friendship?
This is a good topic, exclusivity. So I believe we can all understand that a sexual affair is the act of having a sexual relationship of any sort, any degree, with someone outside the boundaries of a committed relationship. We established in a previous episode that sex is sacred and at the very least special in some way. And
Mm-hmm.
so having that intimate physical connection with someone else is a betrayal.
Hmm.
In the same way, Brad, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable emotionally, sharing deeply of ourselves, things we would generally reserve for our partners, is also a betrayal. That's
Hmm.
the definition of emotional affair. You're sharing, you're being intimate in a different way with someone who is not in the committed relationship with you. And in my thoughts and opinion and practice, the difference is in the commitment as well as in the context. Take flirting, for example. Flirting has a context and a connotation. Banter is playfulness, is platonic. You can banter in friendship,
Hmm.
is implying sexual interest or romantic interest.
Hmm. You're
Okay.
right.
And so if you're being playful in a friendship, in a relationship, it starts to cross the line when we're moving into sexual innuendos, anything related to that type of language. An emotional affair, just like a sexual affair, has warning signs and red flags.
Hmm.
Secrecy, the
Hmm.
tantalization of hiding what's happening from one another, not being transparent or even lying or misdirection when asked or confronted.
Hmm.
I think people know when they're crossing the line because that secrecy piece that, you're hiding things, or then you're also anticipating the next time you're going to engage with that person. Those
Hmm.
are really clear signs that we're moving out of the bounds of the committed relationship.
Yeah.
Hopefully
Yeah.
that's a bit clearer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me try this on for size, Grace. First, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm interested in this, but I think we need to normalize attraction to people who are not our marriage partners.
Mm-hmm.
That might sound risky, but hear me out here. Just because we're married or in a long-term relationship doesn't mean our humanity gets turned off, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
emotional, we're spiritual, aesthetic creatures. We connect with people, we appreciate beauty and friendship, so we're going to be attracted to other people, and I can't see any sense in trying to deny that.
Mm.
And I know that in some relationships, right, it can be a bit of a joke, right? Like, oh honey, I have eyes for you only, or catch our partner looking at someone the other way. There's that famous meme, of the boyfriend looking around at someone else. We
Mm-hmm.
scowl at them, but
Mm-hmm.
I get we want to communicate loyalty to our partner. There's
Mm-hmm.
room for that, but I think it's a bit childlike to expect ourselves or our partners to never be attracted to anyone else. Consider work alone. Some people spend 9 to 5 in an office with other people. And if you're spending that much time with coworkers, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
get to know them well. In a scenario like that, I think it might be the most natural thing in the world to become attracted to someone in some capacity, find them funny, charming, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key for me is this: can we communicate that with our partners? And I think this works in two ways.
Mm-hmm.
In some relationships, it's considered anathema to ever tell your partner you think someone's funny or attractive or whatever it is. But I think that speaks to maybe the fragility of relationships, and it might actually block intimacy and mutual self-giving.
Mm.
If I can't communicate something with my partner, it begins to set up a boundary. So it tells me I can't truly be myself around my partner. So
Mm.
I'm curious what you would think of this, but I would encourage couples to allow that to be on the table for discussion. Now, I don't mean that every day you get home say, hey, I found this person attractive and funny. I don't mean that, but I think,
Mhm.
you know, is there anyone you're currently attracted to? If we can be open with that, then it keeps us from sliding into that, what you were talking about, secrecy thing. And
Mhm.
I think that's a huge thing, Grace, that you mentioned. The moment you don't want your partner to see your phone
Mhm.
because, uh-oh, what if they see the texts?
Mhm.
Or hey, my partner doesn't know that I had a work lunch meeting with this person. The moment those things become secretive,
Mhm.
we're at least flirting with crossing a red line, I think.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
yeah, so those would be my thoughts on that.
I would agree. Something I tell my clients that I believe is also helpful here in our discussion is emotions are neutral.
Hmm.
What you do with them is whether it's going to be helpful or harmful. I also believe it's natural to be intrigued or even attracted to someone else, especially
Hmm.
the longer you get to know them and to spend time. What you do with those thoughts and emotions will either hurt you or your relationship. Remember that verse in Matthew 5 about lust? right? He who looks at a woman to lust,
Mm,
lust means a strong sexual desire.
mm.
That means you've been lingering there for a while.
Yeah.
You
Right.
went beyond a glance to a
Mm.
look, right?
Mhm.
Lingering there,
Mhm.
from respectful banter to sexual flirting. Notice the progression that's taking place here. And communication is a key or an antidote here as well. If you bring this to the light, it removes that power of the forbidden.
Absolutely. And I mean, I find the Genesis creation story just so true on so many levels, right? Like when something's forbidden, we're attracted to it. And
Mhm.
when we start to head there, right, our inclination is to hide, hide, hide,
Mhm.
hide. And I think open communication, honesty is a great antidote, like you said, to that. Just being, hey, I got to be honest with you about this. You can check my
Mhm.
phone anytime, all that sort
Mhm.
of stuff.
Creating
Yeah.
healthy communication and boundaries around use of devices, which is something I work a lot with couples about. It
Mm,
to me, it's a gate left unlocked when you're not talking
mm,
about what's going on with each other's social media, who they're sliding into your DMs and things like that. When you leave that gate open, because
mm.
here's the thing, I also talk with couples. It's like, when you're in a committed relationship, you also have a responsibility. You can't control if Susie at the water cooler is attracted to you, but you can absolutely lock down shut the window, pull the blind,
Yeah.
whatever metaphor you want to use in terms of creating safety around that relationship, talking
Hmm.
about your partner. That's one of the things I admire about you, Brad, is you often talk about your partner, Kristen, and
Hmm.
so people are knowing that, hey, I am exclusively connected to this person.
Hmm. Yeah. That's a real, for me, I want to make that a very regular thing, right? I think it's good and
Hmm.
healthy in many ways, whether
Hmm.
you're a public speaker or not, right? To talk about your
Hmm.
partner often.
Hmm.
Should we go? Okay, now we've got those two down there, Grace.
Hmm.
Number three on the rung is that marriage is a sexual relationship. And let's just go right for the jugular here. I'm going
Okay.
to say this. I'm going to go on record and say this. I think asking how often couples should have sex is a bit of a fool's errand of a question because I think it's going to be different couple to couple. But
Hmm. Hmm.
let's just be frank about it and come at it from the opposite direction. At what point, Grace, do you think not having sex becomes an issue? So let's not worry about how often it should be happening. At what
Hmm.
point does it become a problem, maybe if it's not happening?
Anytime a partner is concerned about their sex life is an issue.
Hmm.
In
Hmm.
working in relationship counseling, I work with couples to help them invite curiosity rather than criticism to the discussion.
Hmm.
You know, unless it was agreed upon that sex is no longer a part of the relationship, is no longer on the table, partners are going to have expectations.
Hmm.
And so if something or someone is interrupting that intimate flow of connection, it's important to discuss it.
Hmm.
Dismissing a partner's concerns in general is hurtful. How much more an invitation to be connected intimately? Rejection is painful.
Hmm.
And so, lack of communication leaves partners feeling uncertain and confused. They're open to their own anxiety spiral. It's just not healthy for the relationship. So,
Hmm.
anytime one partner is concerned, it's time to talk about it.
Mm, that's good, Grace. That's healthy. One of the things that really surprised me, and I don't know why it did, but I was listening to an audio version of David Snarch's A Passionate Marriage,
Mhm.
and he mentioned every aspect of a relationship, there's always one person who wants more of something than the other person. And so
Yeah.
often we think about that with sex, but I love to travel. I
Okay,
would
yes.
travel all the time if we could. Kristen, less so, like one trip a year, maybe that's okay. One partner maybe wants kids more urgently than the others, or
Mhm.
introvert, extrovert. One person wants to go out and
Mhm. Mhm.
socialize. So I think it's healthy to understand in relationships, okay, there might always be in everything a partner who wants something more and something less. Beyond that and into specifics, though, I think it's unwise to make a measuring stick.
Mhm.
There's so
Mhm.
much going on for couples, and things I hear from people, sex is painful, or, there's so many
Hmm.
things going on with couples. But I've always thought too, I heard it from Harrison Scott Key, 3 months, if you haven't had sex in 3 months, maybe go to therapy. And maybe that's a bit of a measuring stick. I don't know, but I actually prefer your definition there. If it's an issue for one person, time to start talking about it.
Absolutely. And that segues into your fourth rung, Brad, total allegiance. We're bringing the whole package to this marriage long-term relationship. Can we start to talk a little bit about that? Total
Yeah.
allegiance.
Yeah, Gottman again has these four things that he talks about loyalty, right? As making a conscious decision not to minimize your partner's negative qualities, maximize the positive qualities. He lists 5 ingredients for that: appreciation, commitment, perseverance, trust, and confidence. So those are the 5 things he lists. Is that something you want to speak to, maybe, Grace? Those
I'll,
5?
sure, I'll speak a little bit to it. The Gottmans fandom here,
Yeah.
you're starting to get that idea. And the Gottmans talk about the 5-to-1 ratio. In their research, they reported that for every one negative comment, you need 5 positive affirmations to eliminate the sting of that one comment. Right. And so when you're focused on the positives, and this is not dismissing that there might be things that need changing, adjusting, correcting, but when you're focused, again, where you're looking is where you're headed, just like driving. When you're focused on the positive qualities versus the negative qualities, you're going to appreciate the small things to the large things. You're going to make a regular commitment to verbally affirm how well your partner is doing. There's an old saying, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. It's true.
Yes.
If
Yes.
you're making a commitment to be appreciative, and then even when things are breaking down, there's conflict, persevering, remember that we're headed for the greater good. We're headed for that top rung of permanency. And so I'm trusting and confident that both of us are heading for the top rung. I'm going to continue to move forward.
Yeah, and it's so good to put skin on words like this, because trust and confidence, we think we know what those mean. But I'll give you an example of, we've already talked about it. I talk a lot about my partner Kristen as part of what I do. I need those stories as part of my work, to be honest. And there's conversation between Kristen and I, what is on the table and what isn't, and what might be comfortable for one person might not be for another. I once told a story in a sermon about a friend I was with who was in the back seat while I was driving and kind of chirping me, doing backseat driving thing. I thought it was a fairly innocuous story, right? But after I learned that they were really embarrassed by that. And, I didn't ask them beforehand if I could tell that story. And I think it's just a good sign to me that it's important with your partner to talk about what is just us and stays right here, and what can we talk about with others. And that might seem obvious to us, but it can really hurt someone to tell a story or break confidence with your partner by exposing something about them they don't want out there. And so those things need to be talked about.
Absolutely. That's allegiance and loyalty, right? In the small ways and in the big ways. Protecting your partner's character, even if it might be funny to you or the situation was funny, or even if you agreed it was funny, that doesn't mean it's fair game. Having those conversations, again, boundaries for the health of the relationship.
Okay, Grace, we've covered 4 of the rungs on the ladder here. It's permanent, marriage is permanent, exclusive, sexual, it's about loyalty. So we've covered those. Let's head into the 5th rung of the ladder, which is a shared identity. And boy, do I have some questions here, Grace, because a shared identity is part of what makes for a healthy marriage. But as I've learned, different words, ideas about all of this are a bit complicated, and there's some unhealthy ways to think about a shared identity. Could you talk to us, Grace, about how we should understand our identity in marriage? What do we mean, for instance, when we use words like enmeshed, interdependent, codependent? Like, there's all these words out there. I get a bit confused. So what's a healthy way to think about our identity in marriage?
Well, Brad, shared identity goes beyond having the same name.
Hmm.
But it's also about sharing beliefs and values, which are the compass that guides the relationship journey. Am I committed to walking not just hand in hand, but heart to heart with my partner? And
Hmm.
barriers to healthy relationship dynamics equals things like enmeshed and codependent. Enmeshed, you can also say entangled. This is where it's hard to determine what's yours and what's mine. It can happen even in a broader context of family systems and dynamics.
Hmm.
There aren't boundaries don't exist here in this relationship dynamic. Codependent is when one's desire for their partner's happiness and well-being is at the expense of their own needs.
Hmm.
In this dynamic, one person is over responsible, which allows the other to underfunction in the relationship. It's off balance and it can build resentment as well as increase risk for abuse and misuse of power and control.
Hmm.
The healthy model that we're striving for is interdependent.
Hmm.
Individuals who are autonomous and then lean in as needed to support each other, sharing their energy, using that word synergy.
Hmm.
That's what we're looking for.
That's really helpful because it can get confusing sometimes, but I really like that. That's helpful. Sixth rung on the ladder here, Grace, is self-sacrificial love and loving the other person by way of sacrifice. And I want to ask you a question about this because in trying to help people understand what it means to love sacrificially, can I ask you, is there any merit to Gary Chapman's 5 love languages? I mean, is this thing for real? Is it a studied thing? Is it a bit of a shtick? I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out if there's anything for real to these 5 love languages. And I heard about them a long time ago. I haven't done
Mhm.
any further reading on it, but just to catch listeners up, Gary Chapman talks about 5 different ways to love each other. And most of us have like a mother tongue, a language that is familiar to us. And the
Mhm.
5 are words of affirmation, number 1, 2, acts of service, 3, receiving gifts, 4, quality time, and 5, physical touch. Is there anything to this, Grace?
Yes. Also a fan of Gary Chapman's work. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually appreciate how the Gottman's work and Chapman's work is absolutely complementary. And I use
Okay.
both in terms of working with individuals, families, and relationships. I think it's important for us to understand that love is an action word.
Hmm.
You know, love is an action word, and we all need love. And Gary Chapman has figured out a way to help us see love as a practical way of connecting with each other as well. And to be
Hmm.
clear, this goes beyond intimate partners. This is these 5 love languages: words of affirmation, acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, physical touch. It covers all relationships. So even looking at it through the lens of friendship, looking at
Hmm.
it through the lens of your children, teens, and young adults, children is really important. Gottman's work uses something similar called the sound relationship house model. And his foundation of that relationship house, so you're looking at the imagery of a house, right? Foundation, walls, door, roof. And the foundation of that relationship house is love maps. And so he
Okay.
he invites couples in relationship to start to build a really strong foundation of love. Tying that with Chapman stuff gives you a really strong practical way to love your partner in a way that sinks in. So love is an action word. How does it become a challenge? Well, if you don't want to know what your primary love language is, you can't communicate it to others.
Hmm.
They don't know how to love you in a way that really fills up your tank. And the other way it goes becomes a challenge is sometimes we want to love our partners the way we want to be loved.
Right.
And if that's not their primary love language, you're missing each other.
Hmm.
All 5 of them are good, but we all have that sweet spot. So if it's not landing, it's not going to be meaningful,
Right.
right? So, for example, let's say I speak fluent Spanish, but
Hmm.
you only understand French.
Hmm.
I could be saying such positive things, beautiful things to you, but if you don't understand my language, we're not going to connect. And so
Right.
knowing what your love language is, being able to communicate that, and then being intentional about loving your partner in the way that sinks in is really important.
Hmm.
The third way it can be a challenge is if we're not consistently committed to putting love in action. our tanks are going to get depleted. A while back, I remember seeing this survey about the personality types who drive cars, and people will see their gas tank, and some will be like under half, maybe even a quarter, maybe even riding the E, and then
Yes.
others never let it go past half.
Yeah.
Right? You
Yes.
know, in the same way your vehicle can incur damage if you're riding on fumes, low fuel, in the same way, the impact on a relationship. It's a risk to the relationship if you keep taking chances with a low love tank.
I always wonder, Grace, this is why I love having these conversations with you, how valid certain things are. But I know just on an anecdotal level, this really resonates because
Mhm.
actually with Kristen and I love buying her clothes. And it's very clear to me every time I do, it just doesn't land. It's just, I don't know if it's my sense of style, what it is, but it's just, that's not how she receives love, me
Mhm.
buying her clothes. And I think that's such an important thing that you mentioned there about how easy it is maybe to fall into, hey, this is how I want to be loved, so that's how I'm going to
Mhm.
show it to you, and how you can be two
Mhm.
ships passing in the night if you're operating that way. So it
Mhm.
would be worth it then, I think, for our listeners, figure out what your love language is, figure out what your partner's is, do that together and
Yes.
communicate that.
And it's a free assessment, 5lovelanguages.com.
There you go. Okay, there you go. There's a little exercise for
It'll
couples to do on their next date night.
absolutely. And there's one for singles, couples, children, teens. So this questions are
Oh,
appropriate to the dynamic that's involved. It take you 15 maximum 15 minutes. They'll send you a copy of your, and then rank it in terms of hierarchy too. So
okay. That's a great
mhm.
idea with kids as well. That sounds like a great
Yes.
resource for people. So check that out.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And the idea, again, with the self sacrificial love is the effort it requires to actually do
Mhm.
the work, figure out how do you receive love? How can I work, even if it's not my native language, right? How can I
Mhm.
figure that out for those I love? That's good stuff.
Mhm.
That brings us to our final rung on the ladder, which is mutual self giving, Grace. And
Mhm.
mutual self giving, when I say that, it means really intimacy, being willing to share of ourselves, our deepest selves. I'm
Mhm.
willing to let my partner in, to expose myself, maybe even the parts of me that are scared or make me
Mhm.
afraid,
Mhm.
willing to let them past our defenses and be vulnerable. So, Grace, my final question of the episode to you would be, tell some ways that couples can foster creating intimacy in their marriage.
This is a beautiful rung as well. First, I want to focus on the word mutual. There are too
Mm,
many relationships that are off balance with one party bearing the majority of the weight of the relationship. That is not fair and it's not sustainable. It's
mm,
incredibly important for folks to be mutually giving and receiving. And there are many ways to improve intimacy, Brad, and I'll share a couple in the work with my clients that I do. So, one of the first things I do, well, right after the love languages assessment, and at some point, I think we're going to talk about conflict in
yes,
relationships.
that's coming up. Yep.
I also used the 5 apology languages, so a little teaser for
Oh,
that.
okay. All right.
So, right after the love languages, and it's incredible how quickly connection can rebuild when people are committed to that love language exercise. So, right after that, I move into encouraging them to have regular date and family business meetings.
Mm,
Put it on the calendar. Research shows that if it's in our calendar, we're more likely to follow through.
mm,
So, dates are about focusing on fun, laughter, sharing memories, creating new ones. The family business meetings are about regular discussions about where the relationship's going. What
mm,
are our goals? How are we reaching our goals? Hopes and dreams, and then divvying up those domestic duties. And of course, with the new each meeting, you're adapting and changing with the new information that's provided.
mm,
Both of these intentions create space for growing in intimacy. Secondly, another resource I use is the relationship intimacy assessment. We talked in a previous episode about 12 facets of intimacy, sharing with each other your level of satisfaction in the relationship and specific ways each person can work to increase your satisfaction level in each area. Okay.
Mm.
So it's not about criticism, but it's about, okay, how are we doing with our leisure intimacy? Like, when's the last time we went and did something fun together? Okay.
Right.
You know, this is what I would like to do. Honey, I love bowling. Can we go bowling on our next date? Like, you're being specific in terms of how you can increase your level of satisfaction. Brad, you and I and many others have experienced the powerful change that can come from allowing therapy with the guidance of a therapist to be a catalyst for growth. I strongly encourage folks to be brave and ask for help to assist them in their wellness journey, whether you're an individual, in a relationship, or family. And this, I think, Brad, this marriage on a ladder, these rungs, and we're going to put it in other contexts in our following episodes. But I think this is something everyone can absolutely strive for.
Absolutely. And I just think there's so much good information this episode, so many things, helpful tips. And like you said, don't be scared to ask for help, because it's there. There is helps available, and it just takes a little bit of courage to take that step. But thank you, Grace, so much for sharing so many helpful things today. And I hope it gives couples, individuals, whoever, a lot to think about and chew on when it comes to marriage, long-term relationships.
Thanks, Brad.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.